Recently, while I was out power walking, memories of my parents rose up. I think it started because my knees were bothering me, and I get that from my dad. But soon my musings became more serious. I was overwhelmed with a sense of indebtedness, of being shaped by forces put in motion long before I was born. Like how Dad doesn't try to fix people, he just loves them. How in his work he sought to protect the vulnerable. Like how Mom is a student of the principled nonviolence of Gandhi and King. She is also the passer-on of the nature-loving heritage of my family. I am who I am because they are who they are, and so on down the ancestral line. Perhaps during our guided meditation, you remembered some of the people who taught you by their example how to live with courage and love. Our theme for November is memory, the practice of honest remembrance and honoring the shoulders on which we stand. This theme invites us not only to consider how we are shaped by memory in our individual lives, but what it means to be a people of memory. I want to thank Lane Craig and our third to fifth grade Harper class for helping us remember whose shoulders we stand on in our Unitarian Universalist tradition. It matters that we remember UUs like Susan B. Anthony honestly, not only as a hero or a shero, but as a complex, even flawed human being. And it matters that we are choosing to remember Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and build on her legacy. During the midterm elections, many different memories of America and visions for America found voice in campaigns. An accurate memory of history is important because, as philosopher George Santayana observed, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That's an argument for knowing well the history of colonization, immigration, Jim Crow, and the always contested nature of democracy in our country. It's easy to get discouraged when you do know more about the ugliness lurking in our past. But historian Howard Zinn reminds us that remembering the good is important too. Zinn wrote, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history," Zinn goes on, "will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction." That's the kind of history I want to help create in my lifetime. So on Election Day, I volunteered for the nonpartisan Prepared to Vote program of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I offered voter cards with accurate information about Texas' complicated voter ID laws and monitored half a dozen polling sites just east of I-35 for any irregularities. It gave me a whole new set of memories about democracy. Like a young man, Latino, voting for the first time. And an older African-American man who struck up a conversation with me about the suppression of the native vote in North Dakota. He saw the injustice keenly. I was inspired by his palpable solidarity with another people deprived of full and unfettered participation in our democracy. People here in this church worked in political organizations, donated, went to rallies, block walked, gave rides to the polls, and of course, voted for candidates and issues they believe in. This great energy and engagement, this hard work for a positive vision in our country, is something else I won't soon forget. I wonder, regardless of who won this time, how will you remember it? Here's how Howard Zinn finished his thought on hope in bad times and remembering the good. If we do act, Zinn says, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Now, today, of course, is not just the Sunday after Election Day, it's also Veterans Day. So as a people of memory, let us acknowledge that our UU tradition has long included not only Peace Corps people and pacifists, but also people who serve in the military. Two Westsiders who are veterans have agreed to share a bit of their own connection to our theme of memory. First, I'd like to find out how many veterans are present in the room today. Sometimes we're surprised by who is a veteran. If you have served in any branch of the military, I invite you to stand or raise your hand as you are able. Thank you. I bet all of those folks have some pretty interesting memories that we could all learn from. At this time, Pete Meador will share some reflections on how we remember veterans. Pete.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I served in the Coast Guard from January of 1967 to December of 1970. Almost exactly 3 years. The Coast Guard is a proud service, and I'm proud to have served with my fellow Coast Guardmen. I served in a port security and law enforcement assignment and the Coast Guard captain of the port office on the Houston Ship Channel. 2 years before I began my service in the Coast Guard, I became a Unitarian Universalist. Over the years, since my time of service and my commitment to UUism, I've been aware at times of tension that some UUs and the church at large have felt at times when considering the role of the military in our society. In 2010, the UUA General Assembly addressed this matter with a statement of conscience on creating peace. Here are some excerpts from that statement of conscience. We all agree that our initial response to conflict should be the use of nonviolent methods. Yet we bear witness to the right of individuals and nations to defend themselves and acknowledge our responsibility to be in solidarity with others in countering aggression. For Unitarian Universalists, the exercise of individual conscience is holy work. Conscientious discernment leads us to engage in the creation of peace in different ways. We affirm a range of individual choices, including military service and conscientious objection, as fully compatible with Unitarian Universalism. On this Veterans Day, what are the images we see, both individually and collectively, when we think of veterans? These images have changed significantly over the past several decades. For some of us here today, our earliest images of veterans were images of white men who served in World War II. Only after many years had passed did other images intrude into our collective conscience. Images of Japanese American veterans who served with distinction in Europe in the Army's all-Japanese 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And African American pilots who served with distinction in the air war over Europe in the all-black 332nd Fighter Group. And by the way, the 442nd, by the end of the war, had been awarded more citations than any other regimental combat team in the entire Army. The 332nd Fighter Group lost only about half the rate of bomber loss, or experienced about half the rate of bomber loss under escort as all the other fighter groups in the Army Air Force. They all served with great distinction. After the Korean War, our images of veterans were still largely of white men, although there were more images of men of color, especially among senior enlisted and commissioned officers. The veterans of the Vietnam era largely reflected the diversity in American society. They also reflected inequalities in our society. Until near the end of the war, educational draft deferments allowed many of privilege to avoid serving. As of 2017, there were just over 7 million Americans who had served in the military during the Gulf War era. Most are now veterans. All were volunteers. They volunteered for a variety of reasons. Some were moved to volunteer after 9/11. Some volunteered because they were part of a family culture that honors and expects military service. Some volunteered to earn educational benefits to pay for education after college that they could have not otherwise afforded. Some volunteered in the National Guard or the reserves to be able to better provide for their families. As in the Vietnam era, they reflect both the diversity and the inequality in American society. Significantly, our images of veterans since the end of the Vietnam era now include women veterans from all walks of life who have served at all levels and all branches of the military. Almost all cities have a parade on Veterans Day. Attendance at these parades increased somewhat during the Gulf War era after declining for many years after the Vietnam era. There are, however, opportunities for more personal ways to recognize and engage veterans. We encounter veterans almost every day as we get on with our lives, but we usually are unaware of their presence. We know we are in the presence of a veteran when we see one wearing a veteran cap. Veterans who wear these caps tend to be older veterans of the Vietnam era and the Cold War era. With rapidly declining frequency, we do occasionally encounter a veteran wearing a World War II veteran cap, but we won't see those much longer. The veterans of the Gulf War era are most easily recognized, or most often recognized, by their tattoos. Whatever the visual clue, you may occasionally realize that you are in the presence of a veteran when you least expect it. You know, when we talk to each other about our values and our worldview, we often use the words intersectionality and connectedness. When you are suddenly aware of a veteran, in your presence, your life has just intersected with that of a veteran. This can be an opportunity for connectedness. While the simple expression, "thank you for your service," is always appreciated, it does seem at times to be a bit impersonal. You might just simply say, "I see you were in the Army," or whatever branch of service. I can tell you from personal experience that you will almost always get a positive response. You might then ask, "What years were you in the Army," or whatever branch of service. "I'm glad you made it back," you might say, if the veteran served in a war zone. "Did you lose any friends?" If the response is yes, perhaps respond with a simple, "I'm sorry you lost some of your friends. Good luck to you. I hope you have a good life." Or if it's a somewhat older veteran, you might say, "I hope life has been good to you." Closing with if the veteran did not serve in a war zone, then you might just simply say something like, "Thanks for taking some time out of your life to serve." Closing with a handshake and eye contact can often say more than can be said with words. The conversations I have suggested to you this morning are not abstractions, at least not for me. I try to connect with veterans by initiating such conversations whenever my life intersects with the life of a veteran. And by the way, I seldom wear this cap. I hate to wear caps. I never wear caps. So most of the time in these conversations, when I approach them, they have no idea they're talking to a fellow veteran. I'm just a stranger that's started up a conversation with them. Many of you may not feel comfortable initiating such conversations with strangers. Perhaps you can find some time today to reflect on why our veterans play a very special role in our society. If you have children who are old enough to grasp the concept of being a veteran, maybe you could have a conversation with them about what it means to be a veteran. Whatever works for you. In closing, I would like to share with you 2 recent conversations I've had. One day I was leaving a large Walmart supercenter when I noticed a somewhat frail-looking man in a wheelchair who was wearing a Vietnam cap. I approached him and initiated a conversation with him. I learned as we spoke that he was an Army medic in one of the bloodiest battles of the war, and that he had held a close friend in his arms while the man died. I told him that I was glad he made it back and that I was sorry his friend didn't. We shook hands firmly and went on our way. I was not wearing this veteran cap, so he had no way of knowing that I too am a veteran, but he shared his story with me. Another conversation happened while I was working as a poll greeter during early voting. I was approached by a young Hispanic woman on her way inside the building to vote. As she passed me, she glanced up and she saw my cap. She turned to me and said, "I'm in the military." I asked her what branch of service and what her specialty is. She replied that she was in the Army and that she drives a fuel tanker. I asked her if she has been deployed. No, she replied, but said that deployment is always a possibility. I wished her well and told her I hope that she will be okay if her unit is deployed, observing, as you might imagine, that sitting in the driver's seat of a fuel tanker during deployment would be certainly risky at some point in time. She acknowledged my wish that she remain safe and went on her way. One day this young woman will become a veteran, or possibly, because of the craziness in our world, she might become a memory in the broken hearts of her family and friends. And so it is with those who serve in our all-volunteer military.
And now I invite forward Gary Randall for a glimpse of one veteran's memories surrounding military service.
Well, good morning, West Side. Before I get started, do me a favor and raise your hand if you've ever volunteered for your church community, your neighborhood, your town or city, your state, or the nation. Let's see a raise of hands. Okay. Thank you for your service. And you should thank each other. When Shari asked me last week to do this, my first knee-jerk reaction was, hell no, I don't want to do that. But this woman is really hard to say no to. She really is. So I had to, in my head, I had to come up with a title. So I called it Plan A, How to Avoid the Draft and Vietnam. So I started Plan A by enlisting in the Air Force to dodge the draft. They can't draft you if you're already in. My reasoning was, in order to fly airplanes and go to war, you had to be an Air Force Academy graduate. I was barely making it out of high school, so college was kind of, no way. Or I could go to Canada. That was just across the river from Detroit, where I lived. Option. Or I could go to jail. Not an option. I didn't agree with what was going on in Vietnam. I did not agree with the U.S. policy. And I found these other two options not really options. So I found myself faced with probably one of the most or the most difficult and troubling decisions that I would ever have to make. I was conflicted by what it meant to be patriotic. Amid the cries of America, love it or leave it, and the anti-war demonstrations, and the nightly news body counts, I was afraid. And yet I volunteered. In the 2 years that I was in Vietnam, I thought about what it was to be patriotic, what patriotism really was. And I came up with the thought that patriotism is like being in a large family. We're all in a family here. I'd do almost anything for any one of you people. And I love you all. But I don't always agree with you. Yet, here we are as a community. And that's what patriotism to me is. It's not America, love it or leave it. It's America, love it. Make it better. My dad was a World War II veteran who shot down over Sicily, was a prisoner of war and the recipient of the Purple Heart. He worked for the Boy Scouts just about all of his adult life, which meant that I was a Cub Scout, I was a Boy Scout, I got volunteered for all sorts of things. He worked in the public relations department of the Boy Scouts when we were in Detroit. And one time I had to dress up in a Greek Boy Scout uniform and go downtown and do some silly thing for the press club luncheon. And now a Greek Boy Scout uniform you're probably not familiar with. Very frilly, fluffy white blouse and a pleated skirt and knee socks. And I'm in high school and I had to get on a goddamn public bus and go downtown, and I didn't say a word when I got on the bus. I just kind of looked at the guy and showed him the address, and bus driver says, you sit right here, 15 cents, you know. It's crazy. Totally crazy. And through my dad's Boy Scouting career, I found out what it meant to be part of a community that, though we were all different, and Detroit was segregated but integrated, I think the Boy Scouts were more integrated, got to rub shoulders with a lot of different people, different backgrounds. And that shaped my life and how I saw the world. So, back to the draft. On September 12th of 1966, I turned 18. My dad and I went down to the draft board. He took the day off from work so I could enroll in the draft. I was still in high school and planning on graduating in January, fingers crossed. And 2 weeks after I signed up, I got a draft notice. So I had to go back down and explain to them, I'm still in school, you can't take me. To which they said, we'll see you in February. So I really started thinking about what the heck I'm going to do. I know the Army guys go to Vietnam, but if you don't fly, you don't go to Vietnam. So at the time, the Air Force had a delayed or deferred enlistment program whereby you took their placement tests, you went down, took the physical, and if you passed, which I did, no bone spurs, you let them know when you were going to be out of school, and then they told you that, gave you a date to come down and be part of the club, and I was told that I'd be trained in electronics. So my plan was going as planned. But, and there always is a but, the Air Force in its great infinite wisdom thought that I was colorblind, which means you can't be trained in electronics. And though it was not true, it took them a year to figure that out. They sent me to a 9-week plumbing school up in Wichita Falls. And by September of 1967, I was in sunny Southeast Asia. For most of my time there, I worked in a combat support civil engineering wing, where we fixed things that got broken. And I volunteered when I wasn't working to bring water and electricity to an orphanage in a small village outside of our base. I'd made some friends with Vietnamese that I worked with and learned a lot about their lives and their culture. And these friends in conversations told me that they just wanted the war to stop. They didn't care who won. And I thought about that. It, to me, made a lot of sense. For many years after I got out of the service, I was ashamed at having been part of that tragedy. And that's what's so complicated about my relationship to my memories of the time. And I asked myself, was I being patriotic or foolish or what? And it's taken a long time to find that answer, and I think I'm still looking. But I do know that all the decisions that I've made throughout my life, and especially around that time, have led me to be here today, this morning, the 11th hour, the 11th day. 100 years ago, people ended a war, the one to end all wars. We still haven't learned. And I'm trying to find, I am finding peace with that past. And now one of the other things that Shari suggested we think about was to hold on to, or think of a memory that you'd like to hold on to while you were in the service. So after I was in Vietnam, I got stationed in Plattsburgh, New York, which is almost in Canada. It's way up at the top of Lake Champlain. And I was on weekends singing with a local young lady guitar at the local Holiday Inn. And prior to an upcoming weekend, we were told that they didn't need us that weekend because there was something going on. So we were rehearsing on a Wednesday evening, and she told me that her sister had told her about this concert coming up down near Poughkeepsie, where her sister lived. And we could go to it's a whole weekend concert. We could go to the concert and then go back to her sister's house, spend the night, and then go to the concert on Saturday. Well, so we jumped in my little MG and tooled down there and got within about a mile and couldn't go any farther because the roads were all blocked. So we walked into Woodstock, and it was quite a trip. It really, really was. After our closing song and words, before you leave this morning, pick up your hymnal, and in the back, go to the reading 583 and take 100 seconds and read it. Thank you very much. I love you all.
Thank you, both Gary and Pete, for helping us to practice honest remembrance and honoring the shoulders on which we stand. May the memories that we today create for others lead to a nation and a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. May it be so. Amen.